show aside from all that.
All right, today we're starting a new session, a new era, and we're going to be over the next couple of weeks looking at the events leading up to World War I and World War I itself. Now, World War I kind of gets overshadowed to a large degree by World War II, but World War I by far is the more consequential of the two major events in world history, because if there had not been a World War I, there never would have been a World War II. You know, understanding the causes of World War II is really easy, but you really can't understand the whole mentality behind World War II unless you understand World War I. So World War I is one of the most important events in the last 150 years for sure, because if you want to understand all the conflicts of the 20th century, even the 21st century, all you have to do is to examine them is to look at the roots of World War I and the impact of World War I on world history. So, in fact, so World War I caused World War II. It was a factor of one of the root causes of the Cold War. That was the war, the battle between communism and free market capitalism for the 50 years or so after World War II. And you could also make an argument that the current struggle against radical Islam or Islamicists and the so-called war on terror, you could make a case that it could be traced back to the events surrounding World War I, especially the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which was a direct result of World War I. All right, so before we start doing all that, we got to look at what caused World War I, and if you understand that, everything else will fall into place. Now, the causes of World War I are very complex, and a lot of different factors are involved. I mean, you could make a case that any one nation caused World War I. You could say, oh, Great Britain caused World War I. No, Germany caused World War I. No, Austria-Hungary caused World War I. No, Russia caused World War I. You could make a case and say that all those countries, in one way or another, was responsible for World War I. And basically, you could also say that they're all responsible. So it's a very complicated story. So what I have to do as a teacher is try to break it down into a way of understanding it. And I think the way to understand it is to see it kind of as a building block. So let's look at that way. So I think underlying World War I, one reason why you had World War I, you have to begin with the fact that the world, and especially Europe and the Western Hemisphere, in the last quarter of the 19th century and early 20th century was experiencing tremendous economic growth. It's sometimes called the Second Industrial Revolution. So you had this tremendous economic growth, tremendous advances in technology, new technology. The world was changing very rapidly at a pace never before seen. So it was a period of very rapid economic and technological change. So that's square one. All right, now, the problem with change and the problem with economic change, even if it has a lot of positive results, and like people experiencing much improved living conditions, for example, or advances in medicine, even though you have these positive developments that come from economic growth and economic change, there's always some problems. And one of the developments we see in this period in the late 19th, early 20th century was that society was on edge throughout Europe. In other words, people were pointing a lot of fingers. And what happened is that this economic growth benefited some people better than others. In other words, it wasn't like uniform positive development for all people. Some people came out of this period as extremely wealthy, very successful, lots of money and power. And other people felt like they had nothing. So anytime you have a situation where some people are doing better than others, it's going to excite envy and arrogance. You know, people who are successful are going to be very arrogant people who are not successful, a lot of times they're going to be very envious of the people who are successful. So when you have envy and arrogance combined, it creates a situation where there's a lot of hatred and division and problems. And if you look at this period, you can see that the social classes, the different social classes that emerged by the late 19th century were really on edge, and there was a lot of hostility and finger pointing going on. It was in this context that radical socialism and anarchism took root among some elements. Now, another development we see is that a lot of times people, when times are tough and people are experiencing change, a lot of times there's this kind of tribal mentality where you rally around people who have the same culture as yourself. And so we see across Europe and in this time period that people who shared a common culture, language, were often at odds with other people. And a lot of times this would occur even within nations. So that, as we'll see, within Germany or within France or within Great Britain, you'd have different ethnic groups that would feel anger and hostility toward another ethnic group. And so you have this great ethnic tension. Now, so what we see happening is that when you have this ethnic tension and the social tension putting everybody on edge, and where everybody's kind of hostile to one another, and it's this very kind of disruptive environment, there's a real danger that a whole society could kind of spin out of control, and you could just have complete chaos and civil war. But you see, in this period, there was a unifying force. What tended to bring people together in this time of strife and social tension, ethnic tension, was nationalism. Now that's the key here, nationalism. Now we already talked about nationalism when we talked about how it was such a revolutionary force in the early 19th century. Well, nationalism did not go away. In the late 19th century into the 20th century, you still had strong sense of nationalism. And so nationalism was a rallying point, so that people, even despite maybe their cultural tensions, despite social tensions, people could all get on board and have a sense of unity, a sense of common purpose, by really appealing to their nationalist tendencies. So if you look at the late 19th, early 20th century, in the eve of World War I, all the great world powers, there was this extreme nationalism where everybody was just so proud to be French, or proud to be English, or proud to be German. So they had this nationalism that was just over the top in this period. Everybody was all like, I will die for my country, to die for your country is the greatest thing in the world. Everybody was just so intense in this period. Now nationalism can be a really good thing because it unites people, brings people together. There's nothing wrong with patriotism, loving your country, of course, but one aspect of nationalism, there is a dark side to nationalism, and that dark side is kind of anger and paranoia about other people. So sometimes, as we'll see, people who said, it's so great to be French, those same people would think, those Germans really suck. Or, hey, we're German, but everybody else is subhuman. They're all inferior to us, kind of like this sense of superiority. So sometimes nationalism can breed a kind of sense of superiority and maybe a fear of other people. It's like, whoa, we got to watch out for that nation and that nation because they're all out to get us because, they're not like us. We're better than they are, and they know it, and they're jealous, that kind of thinking. Now, as a result of this dark side of nationalism, what we see is militarism. That is that the European powers came to believe that the best defense of their nation was by building up huge standing armies, spending a lot of money on arms and guns and all that. And also, what we see is the development of these these military alliances, where the great nations of Europe would form alliances with other nations against a common enemy. So by the time you get to 1914, you had a situation where Europe was an armed camp. You had two competing alliances that were pitted against one another. So you had a very, very tense situation going on. Now, another dark side of nationalism. Another dark side of nationalism was, as we'll see, imperialism. See, the great nations of Europe came to believe that in order to have a strong nation and to look out for the national interest, it was important to acquire overseas territories. So we see that by the late 19th, early 20th centuries, that the great powers of Europe were engaged in this competition to see how much lands they could gobble up in Asia and Africa. It's even called the race for Africa. There was a race among the European powers to see how much land in Africa they could gobble up and acquire. So this is how what was a European conflict became a world conflict, because the great powers were all trying to acquire all these territories in Asia and Africa and competing with one another. And this brought misery and problems for the peoples of Asia and Africa who had to deal with these European rivalries. So, and then finally, so you have a situation where you have two armed camps, where you have these European powers that are competing for overseas territory, building up their armies, very tense, very full of nationalist fervor. And then you had a series in the early 20th century, on the eve of World War I, you had a series of international crises, international incidents that just kind of raised the stakes, that made everybody nervous, where there was always the threat of war. And that's why, and the last of these international incidents was when Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, when he was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian terrorist. This started the Great War. You maybe heard that. You know how all they took was the assassination of the heir to the Austrian-Hungarian throne, and that was all it took. Well, you see, that was just the summit. That was just like the match in the gunpowder factory, or the match in the fireworks factory. You know, that assassination was just after a long line of development. So given the fact that Europe was so tense and you had all these armed nations, it didn't take much for this war just to break out, and it did with a fury in 1914. So that assassination was the last of a series of terrible international incidents that would be the final spark that would start this great war. That was actually, this is the 100th anniversary of the start of World War I. And it started in 1914. This August will mark the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I. So that's what we're going to be looking at for the next couple of weeks or so, looking at these events. So you can kind of go back to this chart to see where we go as we advance over the next couple of lectures. All right, so what we're going to do today is, first of all, look at economic growth. That was the first piece of the puzzle. And I entitled this class "The Rise of Germany," because the real story of the late 19th century is Germany's rise to becoming a great industrial power. You know, Germany, by the end of the 20th century, Germany was the dominant economic power in Europe. You know, Great Britain had formerly been, up until this point, the great economic power, the industrial market dominating power in Europe, but that position was eclipsed by Germany. Germany just took off in the late 19th century. Another country that really took off in the late 19th century was the United States. And in fact, by 1900, the United States was the largest economy in the world, the most industrialized nation in the world, and number two was Germany. So maybe it's not a coincidence that those two nations would be on opposite sides during World War I, one on one side, one on the other. But anyway, but the United States and Germany, and in Europe, Germany were the really big stories economically, with this tremendous economic growth. So why did you have this economic growth? Well, this period, beginning of about the mid 19th century, this is sometimes it's called the Second Industrial Revolution. And what was really spurring the Industrial Revolution in this time was the tremendous growth of railroads. Railroad construction was taking off across the world in the late 19th century. And why would that be so significant? Well, there's a number of different ways that railroads had a tremendous impact on the economy. One thing about railroads is they increase markets. With railroads, you can get goods greater distances and to more people at a faster pace. So that means that railroads really increase markets. So you can be producing a product and be selling your product hundreds, maybe thousands of miles away to consumers that you'll never see. So that's one thing about railroads. The more railroads that were built, that meant that more and more people could participate in the economy, in the market economy, buying consumer goods. So it really expanded markets on a scale never before seen. The railroads were the internet of the 19th century, or you could say that the internet is the railroad of the 21st century. But the railroads were very important for expanding markets in this period. Now, another thing about railroads is that they really sparked the growth of factories and urbanization. You see, now that there are more and more people demanding goods, you needed to mass produce goods to meet those demands. And so what would happen is that whenever a new railroad was built, people would locate their factories and businesses near where the railroad stopped so that they could put their goods directly on the railroads and get them to market. So whenever railroads were built, factories would be built, and where there were factories built, there would be towns built. And towns would grow very quickly. In fact, most of the towns, even here in East Tennessee, go right back to the railroad. I mean, there was no Johnson City or Bristol until they built the first railroad in this region in the mid-1850s. They were both laid out. In fact, Johnson City used to be called Johnson's Depot because that's where the train stopped. And as soon as that, and then for a while there in Johnson City, since they raise a lot of cattle here, they had a lot of tanning factories. Were the first factories in Johnson City where you process cattle for making leather. And Bristol was laid out right at the same time, right, mid-18, I think 1854, as a town because of the introduction of a railroad. It ran from Atlanta to Richmond. And then Kingsport and Irwin were both built when they built the second railroad in 1905 or so. They completed the second railroad that ran from, I think, North Carolina to Ohio. And that's how Irwin, that's why Kingsport was planned as an industrial town, because it was located right along that railroad. In fact, the builder of that railroad was a man by the name of George Carter. He was the one who gave the land to build East Tennessee State University. So railroads are very important in the growth of towns, and I mentioned East Tennessee because even right here, these events of late 19th, early 20th century spawned the growth of factories and urbanization, the growth of towns. Question?
My famous at Burlington. The Germans built that, then we took it from them after World War I.
The what? Which one?
Burlington in Lisbeth.
Oh.
Was it Burlington or Bimberg?
No, it was the rayon factory. I think
rayon.
It was Bimberg, yeah. Now, excuse me. Now, another way that railroads spur the economy was because for railroads you need lots of steel. And also for railroads you need lots of coal, because coal, you burn the coal to create the steam. These were all steam engines, right? So as a result, as railroads expanded, so did the steel and coal industry. Some of the biggest industries and industrial enterprises in the late 19th, early 20th century were coal mining and steel mills. That's why, for example, Western Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, was such a flourishing town in the late 19th century, because you had the coal mines right there, and they built a lot of steel mills in Pittsburgh because the coal was right there. You didn't have to transport the coal very far, and that's why even today, even though they don't have any steel anymore in Pittsburgh, the football team is still called the Steelers. Now, in Germany, it was the Ruhr Valley. the Ruhr Valley of Germany was like the Pittsburgh of Germany. It was like they had all this coal there, and that's where there was a company called Krupp that built. There was one of the big steel manufacturers in all of Europe that was located in the Ruhr Valley, just like in western Pennsylvania, that's where the coal was. So the railroads really spurred the growth of the steel and coal industries. They just took off in the late 19th century. Now, railroads also impacted things like agriculture, because with railroads, you see, because you could just bring in food, some areas didn't have to raise food anymore. They didn't have to create food because they didn't have to grow food, because they could just bring in food on the railroad. So that meant that certain areas could just devote their whole acreage to growing specialty crops for the larger market. Like in the late 19th century, Southern California and Florida became centers of the citrus industry, because you could grow lemons and oranges there, and that's why they could devote all of their acreage to just orchards of lemons and orange groves, because they didn't have to worry about raising food, because they could just bring that in on the railroad. So you see, that's what I mean by agricultural specialization. Plus, another big development was the refrigerated railway car that came into place. That made it possible to refrigerate food. So that meant that somebody could enjoy an orange or a lemon in New York City in the middle of winter, because they could cart it up bring it up on the railroad. In Germany, northern Germany, it was hops for beer making. They just grew nothing but hops in northern Germany. In the south of France, it was wine. They could just devote all their acreage to wine production, because they didn't have to grow food, because they could just bring in the food on the railroad. Another thing about all this was that the railroads ended disastrous famines. Anywhere the railroads went, it was possible, you could just cart in food. So if there was a local harvest failure, remember, malnutrition had been one of the biggest causes of population limits, because, whenever you have malnutrition, it affects the children the most. And then they're the most liable, their defenses are weakened, and they're the most liable to die from epidemic diseases or any kind of disease. So with the railroads, that meant that you could just bring in food when you had a local bad harvest, and that meant that basically disastrous famines became a thing of the past. So the result was that every time the railroads were built, as you expanded the railroads, populations just took off. So you had this huge population growth, especially in Eastern and Southern Europe at this time. Just people were just having kids left and right. And that also benefited the economy, because that meant more consumers buying more goods. Also created some other problems as well. But now another impact of the railroad was that the railroads created the idea of the huge giant corporation. And why was that? Well, see, building a railroad is a major operation. You need lots of labor, you need lots of land, you need a lot of money up front, and it's a big giant operation. So in order to make railroads possible, companies had to get very big. They had to have a bureaucracy in place. They had to have engineers. They had to have accountants. They had to have supervisors. They had to have a large workforce. And so corporations became very, very big. Some of the first big corporations in the history of the world were railroad companies, and some of the wealthiest men in America and in the world were what we call railroad barons, people who made their money off the railroad, like the Vanderbilts. Maybe you've heard of Vanderbilt University. The Vanderbilts, or the Biltmore here in Asheville. Anybody been to the Biltmore in Asheville? That was built by the railroads. I mean, the money to build that came from railroads. That's how the Vanderbilts put their money, and they built railroads. So railroads. Another thing about railroads was that they created a linkage with banking. You see, the way that a big corporation works is that they have to raise capital by selling bonds. They basically borrow the money, or they have to either sell shares, so people buy their stock, or they sell bonds, and then people buy their bonds. When you sell a bond, you're basically going into debt. and with the understanding you're going to pay it off. So in order to these corporations to grow, you needed to have a banking sector that was willing to invest. And so investment banking took off, where bankers would invest their money in a lot of railroad companies or other companies. I don't know if you've heard of J.P. Morgan. It's one of the biggest banks in the world, but J.P. Morgan was a man. He was an Englishman who came to New York City right after the Civil War, and he built an empire, a financial empire, a banking empire, because he was one of the world's first great investment bankers. He invested in. He was able to get a lot of money from investors and take money and invest them in new companies, like Thomas Edison's General Electric. And maybe you've heard of General Electric, founded by Thomas Edison. Well, who do you think gave Thomas Edison the money to build General Electric? J.P. Morgan and his bank. But investment banking first emerged as a big major enterprise because initially you needed, for railroads to really expand and to raise capital or raise money, they had to sell bonds, and it was the big investment banks that were buying up these bonds and investing in these railroads. So the growth of giant corporations and the growth of investment banking were all kind of very much stimulated initially by the growth of railroads and the need for railroads for large amounts of capital or money to invest. All right, now the railroads were not the only cause for tremendous economic growth in this period. There were a lot of new industries. There were a lot of new advances in technology that allowed for whole new industries. For example, right now we see this right now in the sense that there's a market for. There used to be a market for personal computers. Now there's a market for tablets and smartphones. I mean, you can't really have a market for smartphones until somebody invents a smartphone, right? So it takes an inventor first to come up with a new product, and that starts a whole new industry. So we're seeing that right today with all these new people selling apps, and we got apps, and we got smartphones, and we have all these new industries coming up. But it was the same thing back 100 years ago, 150 years ago. But it was things like electricity or other new industries. And I'll just give you a couple examples. You mentioned rayon. Rayon is a synthetic fiber. It's manufactured. Rayon. So once somebody came up with rayon, and later on it would be polyester. That would be later on in the 20th century. But rayon was one of the first synthetic fibers. You could use it to make cloth. So a whole new industry was born because somebody invented a new product, rayon. Same thing with electricity. Thomas Edison was an American. He's pictured here. There he is. Thomas Edison was an American who, great story. He started out as a king. Never went to school. He's the world, America's greatest inventor. Never went to school. When he was a young boy, he was working on a railroad selling cigarettes. Selling magazines and cigarettes. Those little boys who said, "Get your cigarettes." That's how he made his money as a kid. But the guy was a genius. I guess he only needed to sleep like 2 hours every night. He would just take 15-minute naps. But he was always inventing stuff. And one of his great inventions was the light bulb. Actually, his light bulb would have created fires, but George Westinghouse invented alternating current, so it made the light bulb viable. But before Thomas Edison, when people had a great idea, a candle would appear over their head. But after, that's a joke. But then, he was the first guy who had the light bulb over his head, because before him there wasn't a light bulb. See, so that's Thomas Edison. And now the thing about Thomas Edison was that he built. Not only did he invent stuff, but he created a new company. For example, in 1885. He created General Electric with money from J.P. Morgan, which specialized in producing electronic products and generating electricity, being a power company. Another guy who was into electricity was George Westinghouse. George Westinghouse made his money by inventing an air brake for the railroads, but then he took that money and he began to invest in different electronic products. He was the guy who came up with the alternating current that made a light bulb from starting fires. So he even though Thomas Edison gets the credit for inventing the light bulb, with coming up with the idea of the light bulb, it was George Westinghouse's improvement that allowed for the light bulb to actually be viable and work on a large scale. Another big new material that was being used was oil. Oil was this sticky stuff, but about in the 1850s they figured out that you could take oil and make kerosene from it, and kerosene can be used to produce light and also as heating, for heating oil and for light, for kerosene lamps and kerosene ovens and so forth. And turns out Pennsylvania is not only rich in coal but rich in oil. And the first oil drill, what do you call those things, like oil rig in all the world was in Titusville, Pennsylvania, 1859, just right on the eve of this. And there was a man by the name of John D. Rockefeller who saw potential in all this, and he founded a company called Standard Oil that almost had a near monopoly on the sale and manufacture of oil. Now, the thing about it was that Rockefeller was one of the world's first billionaires, and he made most of his money by just selling kerosene. But you see, there was in the works were new sources of using oil. There was a Frenchman. He was actually born in Austria, but he spent his life in Paris. A man by the name of Rudolf Diesel. Okay, here's Diesel. That's Rockefeller right there. Here's Rudolf Diesel. What do you think Rudolf Diesel invented?
Diesel fuel?
Well, yeah, diesel is a form of oil, right? It's a refined oil, gasoline. And what he did is figured out was you could use gasoline to run an engine. So he came up with an engine that could run on gas, right? This is like in about 1882. Now, some years later, a German by the name of Carl Benz, here he is. Carl Benz, he was the guy who figured out that you could use a gasoline engine to run an automobile, a mobile that runs on itself. So basically Carl Benz, does that name ring a bell? Mercedes, Benz, yeah. He actually was the guy who invented the idea of a self-propelled automobile. But you see, it was an American by the name of Henry Ford who took this idea and ran with it. In the sense, he was the first person to take the car and make it into a consumer product, because he innovated in new ways to mass produce cars. Like he implemented the first moving assembly line. How many people have seen one of those moving assembly lines where the car room is on a track and people put on the doors and that kind of. Now it's done with robots, but it used to be done by people. I think it's still done by people somewhere. But it was he found new ways of mass producing cars. So the car went from being a plaything of the rich, something like an oddity, kind of like Google Glasses today. Google Glass is like in the experimental stage, but it could be, there might be a time 10, 15 years now where everybody's got the little glasses on. We all could be like, look like space cadets, But anyway, I don't know if that's ever going to take off. But maybe there was a time when people thought that cars were just a big joke and they would never take off. But Henry Ford found a way of mass producing cars, and it wouldn't really take off till the 1920s. But he was the guy who got the ball rolling. So Henry Ford didn't invent the car, he didn't invent the automobile, but he basically got the ball rolling. He planted the seeds for the mass production of cars, so that cars became a consumer product. Another big inventor was he was from Scotland, but he immigrated to the United States. A man by the name of Alexander Graham Bell. Alexander Graham Bell was actually a medical doctor, and he was actually trying to figure out a way to help people who are hard of hearing, help the deaf, and he accidentally invented the telephone. So it was like, but he was a smart guy, and he said this telephone thing might work, and he eventually founded a company, put together a company called AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph. Maybe you've heard of AT&T. 1885, same year that General Electric was founded. So he also took an invention, and made it into a product. It started a whole new industry of telephones and also telephone service. But that really took a while it was invented in 1876. It took a while. Even in the beginning of the 20th century, telephones were still an oddity. Basically you had to go to a store to, a public phone to find a phone. Most people did not have a phone in their house, even up until after World War I in a lot of places. So, but it started a whole new company. So there were a host of inventions in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and these inventions would lead to whole new industries. And these industries would create jobs and new companies and really stimulate economic growth. Now, another important development at this time was the what we call scientific management. Large companies were realizing that the key to profitability, to profit, if you're a company, you have to sell stock, and you have to sell your bonds to raise money. And the only way people are going to buy your stock and buy your bonds is if you're profitable. You're making lots of money. So companies realize, hey, we need to be profitable. We need to make a lot of money. And what they discovered was that the key to making lots of money was what we call productivity. Be able to produce more and more at less of a cost. That's why a lot of companies invested in technology and new processes, because they wanted to lower their costs using technology, because anytime you lower your costs and can increase your production, you're going to have more money, you're going to have more profits. Now, what we see is that a lot of companies realized that they needed to have well-run companies that were scientifically managed if they're going to have a lot of productivity and thus lots of profits. So one of the things we see at this time is something called vertical integration, where a company would basically, one company would come to control all aspects of an industry. One of the first companies to do this was Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller's company. He started out in the refining business. That's where he started out. Standard Oil was originally just in the process of refining oil, raw oil, into kerosene. But he said, this is not productive enough. I can be much more productive if I control all aspects of the industry, from drilling to transportation, transporting the oil, to refining it, and then marketing it. So basically, that's what vertical integration means, that all aspects, up and down. Vertical means up and down, right? So all aspects from drilling the oil all the way to refining it and then distributing it were controlled by one company. And a company that controls and dominates a field is called what became known as a trust. It was John D. Rockefeller set up a trust of trustees to control all the different companies in all the different states that were part of this vertical integration process. And so the name stuck. So a trust was used to describe any kind of company that dominates an industry and controls all aspects of the production process. In Germany, it was called a cartel. Like in Germany, pretty much the steel and coal companies were pretty much dominated by Krupp. Krupp came to dominate coal and steel production within Germany. It's funny, the Krupps collaborated with the Nazis, and they were never prosecuted after World War II. But anyway, so did all those car companies. They all worked with the Nazis, but they all got off.
Hugo Boss.
What?
Hugo Boss got its start making Nazi uniform.
Well, we wanted to make sure that Germany could recover when it was all over. Now, another development we see is that companies, these large-scale companies, they realized that if they were going to have a well-trained workforce and have a productive workforce, they needed to get people to get adequate training. And so what we see happening in America and in Germany in particular is that there was a new development in education. You see, traditionally colleges and universities had existed primarily for the elites. Universities have been around since the Middle Ages in Europe, and they primarily were for training priests and churchmen, but also lawyers and doctors, and only a very small percentage, usually the aristocracy and only the wealthiest people could afford to go to university. And the idea was it was a proper training ground for a gentleman. But in the late 19th century, a lot of companies and a lot of policymakers realized that companies needed to actually train people to do practical things. They needed accountants. They needed engineers. They needed people who could fix stuff, right? They didn't want just smart guys who could talk theology and philosophy. They wanted people who could actually get a job done. So there was a shift to colleges and universities becoming training grounds where you would train for a career in these big companies, especially when it came to engineering and accountants, to train, to run these companies. In fact, the United States was on the cutting edge of this. In 1862, called the Morrill Act, the United States government, the federal government, set aside federal land, the sale of federal land, to build public universities, specifically to train engineers and to train in technology. That's why, a lot of public universities in the United States have A&M next to them, like Texas A&M, Texas Agricultural and Mechanical. That's what it stands for. Clemson is the technology school for South Carolina. Georgia Tech is a technology school for Georgia. The list goes on and on. I mean, where these schools, Penn State, it was founded as a land grant institution. A whole host of them. Michigan, out west, Texas, a lot of different schools were founded by the federal government. I mean, well, they were under the jurisdiction of the states, but they were founded because the federal government set aside the sale of federal land to build up those colleges and those universities. So the result, and the same thing happened in Germany. In Germany, a whole host of new colleges and universities were founded with the mission of training people in technology careers. So the whole purpose of the college changed from basically training the elites to be gentlemen to becoming training grounds for an expanding middle class to get jobs in the emerging economy. So that was a big, this advantage, it's probably not a coincidence that the two countries that invested the most in this type of education and pragmatic vocational education, Germany and the United States, were the two countries that experienced the most dynamic economic growth in this period. All right, now it's I say all that, and the greatest inventor in American history never went to school. Genius has no bounds. All right, now, now with all this, we mentioned all these growth and technology advances and all these great achievers, but there is a price to this economic growth. And that's what we need to look at next. But we've gone for quite a long time here. Why don't we take a bit of a break here for about 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll pick it up when we get done. All right, let's talk a little bit about economic problems. We talked about how there was a lot of economic growth and prosperity in the late 19th, early 20th century, but with this growth came some problems as well. What we saw often in especially Eastern and Southern Europe was that the population growth exceeded the jobs that were there. In other words, the growth of factories was slower than the rate of population growth, and so that meant that there was a lot of unemployment, and there was also a lot of people in the countryside who couldn't find work as agricultural laborers. And so this spawned a massive flow of immigration, because what happened is that a large numbers of people from Eastern and Southern Europe went where they could hopefully find jobs and new opportunities. And that's why there was this surge of immigration in the United States, for example. In the late 19th, early 20th century, people from Eastern Europe, from Russia, people from Italy, Southern Europe, they came in large numbers to the United States. In fact, I think in 1890, I think something like 90% of the population in New York City was born overseas. I mean, so in big cities in the United States, you had all these people who were primarily immigrants going to the United States in search of jobs. A lot of the railroads were built by immigrants. Like a lot of Irish and Italian laborers. A lot of the coal mines were worked by Irish and Italian and whoever who could find work who came and settled in this country. But they weren't just immigrating to the United States. There was a huge surge of immigration to Australia and to Canada. Canada and Australia, like the United States, are nations of immigrants. So you can find in Australia and in Canada today people who are of Italian and Russian ancestry who came to these lands in search of a better life. Also, South America was settled by large numbers of immigrants. Large numbers of Italians settled in South America. So Brazil and Argentina and Chile were settled by immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. So you had this large immigration also influencing the economy and society of South America and North America, as well as Australia and New Zealand even in Asia. Now, another problem was that the people who worked in the factory towns, the people who worked in the cities, these people who worked for wages, a lot of times they were very unsettled. And there are a couple of factors for this. One factor was that wages, because of this large population growth, there was such a supply of labor that wages were pretty low. So workers worked long hours for pretty low wages, what we would consider very, very low wages. And they often had to work, they often lived in crowded and dirty apartments. They were called tenements. They were often, there was no standards for housing, so a lot of times, you'd have like a family of 12 living in one room, and the only toilet would be down the hall. And so, the cities were very dirty, a lot of sewage problems. That's why there was epidemics with cholera and typhoid. And these were a frequent problem in the big cities because they were filled with lots of dirty tenement houses where people lived in crowded conditions. So people worked for long hours. A typical work week was about 60 to 70 hours. You worked 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, period. And that was what you were expected to do. Also, there was most countries in Europe up to a point had no concept of accident insurance. If you got hurt on the job, it was your fault. You got hurt on the job, you got your hand cut off, got your leg cut off, you died, whatever, so be it. The company's not liable, you are. So basically that created a situation where an accident on the job could basically destroy your family. There was no Social Security, there was no welfare, there was nothing. So basically if you got sick or was hurt on the job, your family starved. Or you had to hope that maybe a charity or a church would provide you with some help, or maybe local assistance. So there was no safety net in that. So workers lived in a lot of fear and uncertainty because they were that close to an injury or a sickness, basically leading to starvation and homelessness. And then there was also a problem in the sense that periodically the economy would tank. It was called today we call it a recession. But back in the late 19th century, it was called a panic. And the reason it was called a panic is because it involved literal panic. See, what would happen is that during this period, you'd have these periods of great economic growth, and companies would just keep on producing and producing and producing, right? And they would invest in a lot in machinery and new technology and hire new workers, and they would borrow lots of money from the banks, right? They'd borrow money from the banks. They'd sell bonds. They would, and banks. They'd get money from the banks. Well, let's say what would happen would be that after a while, with everybody producing goods on a scale, you'd have a situation where prices would get really low because there was an overabundance of goods. So the amount of supply would exceed demand. Well, when prices came down and it looked like companies wouldn't be able to honor their debts, that meant that banks were in trouble. And what would often happen is that these banks would all get into trouble all around the same time because they would all be dealing with the fact that there was some question whether or not they were going to get their money back. Well, in those days, you see, if a bank went down, if a bank bankrupted, anybody who had money in that bank would lose whatever money they had in that bank. So if a bank went bankrupt, all the people who had money in that bank lost everything. So let's say that you have a situation where it looks like the banks are in trouble. All it would take would be a rumor. And everybody would be like, I gotta go to the bank and get my money out. And so you'd have what was called a run on the bank. People would run, literally run to the bank, pounding on the door, give me my money! I mean, this happened periodically. And a lot of banks would go bankrupt. That meant that everybody who had money in that bank would lose everything. And then that would have like a domino effect on the economy, because banks would go bankrupt, companies would lose money, companies who had money in the banks would lose everything, companies would have to fire workers to make up for their losses, and you'd have large-scale unemployment. And so these panics occurred periodically. In America, for example, you had the Panic of 1873, you had the Panic of 1893, you had the Panic of 1907. So you had these periodic panics where the economy would just collapse, and you'd have economic decline, and then it would take a while for the economy to build itself back up. It would build itself up, and then you'd have another panic, and another deep economic decline. But if you're a worker, if you lost your job, there's no unemployment insurance. There was nothing. So if a company decided they were going to lay off or cut wages to make up for lost revenues, that meant that a lot of people would be hurting because they would have no money or no job, and they would have a hard time feeding their families. So there was a great deal of economic uncertainty and fear across Europe and America, in every part of the industrialized world, because nobody really knew when everything was going to collapse, or when they were going to lose everything. Now, one of the reasons why you had these economic panics was because of oversupply. There was too much goods and not enough buyers, and actually countries made this problem worse by putting up high trade tariffs. See, a lot of countries, the United States was the same way. The United States, all the European countries, they figured that one way they could really promote their own industries was by putting tariffs on imports. See, if you put a high tax on an import, that makes that import more expensive. So people are more likely to buy goods that are cheaper, that are produced domestically. So every European country and the United States would raise these tariffs with the idea that this was going to promote their own economy, their own industry. But you see, if everybody does it, you see, you create a situation where you're limiting markets, you're limiting demand. So that actually made the problem of oversupply worse. So you can make a case that one reason why these panics were worse than they had to be was because governments were all promoting these tariffs and putting up these tariffs and creating this artificial oversupply. And that's one reason why one of the goals of policymakers after World War II, and has been the goal of policymakers ever since, was to do everything possible to reduce tariffs and promote free trade, because it's been shown that part of the big problem of the late 19th century and early 20th century were these tariffs that created these problems, or at least aggravated these problems. All right. Now, another thing we see happening is because of this economic growth and this economic uncertainty, there are a lot of tensions at the time between the different social classes. Now, by the time you get to the late 19th century, you could see that there were three clear classes in Europe. In America, really, you only had two. But in Europe, you had three classes. You had the old aristocracy that was still around, the old landowning aristocracy. Now, America didn't have an entrenched aristocracy like that, but Europe did. And then you had a middle class that was making money off of banking, industry, and trade, and their ranks were growing, and their wealth was growing. And then you had a third class of working people. Now, you had some agricultural laborers still working, who were landless agricultural laborers in the countryside. And you also had a growing number of workers who worked for wages in the growing factory towns. Now, in this period, two of the classes were very fearful and uncertain, and that would be the aristocracy and the working class. The middle class, they were doing great. This was the high point of being middle class, if you could obtain that status. One reason why the aristocracy was so uncertain is because they were anxious. And now the aristocrats, they weren't starving to death by any means. They were doing fine. They still had their landed estates, and they still owned lots of land, and they still lived in palaces, but they were having a hard time keeping up the lifestyle because they weren't making as much money as the middle class was making. The middle class was making more money than they were, and that terrified them because they were used to being on top. The aristocracy was used to being the dominant class, and now that their status and their position in society was slipping as they saw these newcomers rising up the ranks and making all this money and being very successful. That's one reason why some aristocrats figured, well, we'll just marry their daughters and get their money. In fact, Bermuda, in Bermuda, it used to be the case that one reason Bermuda became a big holiday sensation was because wealthy middle-class American families who had lots of money, they would send their daughters, their unmarried daughters, to Bermuda because wealthy aristocrats from England, when their younger sons were unmarried, they'd be officers in the British Army, and they would often be stationed in Bermuda. So Bermuda became the place to get an MRS degree for a lot of women. Wealthy American women would go to Bermuda, and they would meet. They'd have dances, and the wealthy aristocratic British officers would date them. And so the British officers were looking for a rich woman from America so they could have lots of money. And then Americans wanted, oh, my husband's a duke. They liked that idea of being married to aristocracy. In fact, the Vanderbilts married into English aristocracy. All of them did. A lot of them did anyway. Winston Churchill, the Churchill family was a very distinguished, wealthy, aristocratic family, and actually Winston Churchill's mother was an American heiress. So the Churchills did the same thing. They married a rich, wealthy American woman, and the product was Winston Churchill, who was half American. But anyway, so you had an aristocracy who was a little nervous, a little concerned that their social position, their dominant position was slipping. So that made them really tense, and they wanted to find ways to make themselves relevant. And then you had a very confident middle class, a middle class that was making lots of money from the growth. All this growth of trade and industry was making it so that the ranks of the middle class were growing in number, and their wealth was growing. So this was a period of great confidence. In American history and in English history, the mid to late 19th century is called the Victorian era. And the Victorian era was a great time for the middle class. Even Queen Victoria, who was an aristocrat as you can be, kind of adopted the mannerisms and the lifestyle, at least publicly, of a middle class person, because that their numbers and their influence was growing in England. Now among the middle class, there was this great deal of confidence, and they just were full of it, full of confidence. And now for the middle class, what we see happening is one aspect of the middle class was that they believed that their success was due to their moral superiority. So many members of the middle class said, well, because we're good Christians, because we work hard, we're thrifty, we save our money, we don't spend a lot of money on frivolous and immoral activities like gambling and drinking, that's why we are so successful, because of our great Christian morality. And so one aspect of the middle class was that in England and America, it was very closely affiliated with membership in good standing in the church. And that was true in England and in America. In France, in primarily Roman Catholic France, being a good, respectable middle-class person meant being a good, respectable Roman Catholic. So for many members of the middle class, they assumed this kind of moral superiority, and there was a lot of hypocrisy too. I mean, a lot of times they were more interested in the appearance of religiosity than they were actual religiosity. So there was a lot of guys were out going to houses of prostitution, but they showed up to church every Sunday. You see that. I mean, it's not any different today, of course. But there was that aspect to it. But another aspect of the middle class, some members of the middle class really were confident about that they equated their success with the advancement of science and reason. So one aspect of the middle class was this belief that that their enlightenment, their reasonableness, their education was the reason for the great success of the middle class. One of the more influential thinkers of this time period, who really had a great influence on the thinking of the middle class, was a man by the name of Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer was an Englishman who was very popular in the lecture circuit in both the United States and in Great Britain, and he advocated this idea of social Darwinism. Now, he was inspired by science. There was in 1859, Charles Darwin had published the very influential work called *The Origin of Species*, and where he had put forth this idea of evolution, that life evolved over time, and that this struggle for, he used the phrase struggle for survival. The idea was that species that adapted to the environment would evolve and develop into new species, and those who didn't adapt would die off. Well, Herbert Spencer took that idea and applied it to society. He would argue, he would say, well, people who embrace reason and who are daring and innovative and who are working to advance science and technology, they are the survivors. They are the winners. They are advancing society. So Herbert Spencer would go and meet with all these wealthy men and say, your success is due because you're enlightened, because you're reasonable, because you're advancing society through technology. And those people who are reasonable and scientific and knowledgeable, they're going to advance, and the people who do not go with the flow, they are going to die. And they deserve to die because they're losers. We don't, if all these poor people die because they don't have jobs, or they're drinking, or they're taking drugs, well, that's their own fault. They, get rid of them. They're ruining the gene pool. They didn't have genes. They didn't know about genes back then, but they're ruining the race. So we want to advance superior people who will advance the human race. So people who are dumb and stupid and retarded and whatever, let them just die, because we don't need them, because they are holding us back. We need to advance the human race. We can only do that through advancing science and advancing good, hardy people. That's why some people who embrace social Darwinism actually embraced eugenics, the idea of, in a lot of parts of the United States, for example, they began to, people who were serial criminals or mentally retarded or had mental problems, they would castrate them so they could not have children, so that they wouldn't perpetuate bad forms of the human race. So that even here in the United States, there was eugenics practiced in the early part of the 19th century. Now, one of the problems with social Darwinism is that some people came to assume that people who were not some peoples were not as advanced as others. That other nations, let's say other peoples, were at a lower stage of development and therefore were subhuman or inferior. So social Darwinism became a way of promoting this idea that people of European stock were somehow superior and more advanced, more evolved than people who were less advanced. This is a sad story. When they discovered pygmies in Central Africa, they were convinced that this was proof of evolution, that these pygmies were a lower developed form of the human race. And they actually kept pygmies in the New York Central Zoo in the early part of the 20th century. So people could say, look, this is evolution. These people are less inferior, these pygmies. We know pygmies are fully human beings like anybody else, but that was the thinking at the time. So that was a very now another way of thinking about the world was a man by the name of Auguste Comte. He was a Frenchman, and his ideas were very influential in the time period across America and Great Britain. It was called positivism. Auguste Comte believed very strongly that through the advancement of science and reason, that you would see the improvement and advancement of the human race. Kind of going back to the ideas of the Enlightenment. And so he advanced this idea of constant reform, that there was only through constant reform that society could improve and advance. And so his adherents really were big believers in advancing what we call the social sciences, the idea of studying society scientifically to come up with solutions, rational solutions to deal with problems like poverty and crime or abuse, and ending these problems. Another important thinker on among the scientific middle class folks, people were an Englishman by the name of Jeremy Bentham. He came up with a philosophy called utilitarianism, and Jeremy Bentham was actually was an atheist materialist, but he believed the only way to measure human progress was through the improvement of the human condition. The more people are eating better, people have more food and have more free time and are healthy, that equals improvement. So utilitarians were always looking for ways, people inspired by Jeremy Bentham's thinking were always thinking about how can we make society better, how can we advance material prosperity, how can we make it so that people are healthier, people have better standards of living, people live longer. What can we do to promote these material aspects of the human condition? So among the middle class, and all these guys, Comte, Bentham, Spencer, they all came from the ranks of the middle class, and their ideas were very influential in shaping this and influencing this real sense of superiority and this confidence that was common among the middle class. So you had a very anxious aristocracy, you had a very positive and almost, I'd say, arrogant middle class that felt that they could do no wrong, that the future was theirs. And then finally, you had a working class that was just pissed off. Just pissed off. And that's where we had a lot of problems back in the 19th century. You had a lot of these working people who were just angry, they were mad, they didn't like what the situation they were in, and the result was that they were the ones who were being organized into the anarchist movement and revolutionary movements that scared the bejesus out of the middle class. And that would be a big source of the problems, of the social problems, with this growth of this angry working class. That would be a big source of social disruption. All right, well, that's what we're going to get to next time. We ran out of time today, but we're going to talk about social and ethnic tension and get to competing alliances and militarism. We're going to do that on Tuesday.